welcome to Maine Veterans Voices. This is a series of interviews with Maine veterans that will be stored for posterity at the Library of Congress. And the idea is to discuss the veterans' experience in the service, but also their experience in Maine after their service and how they came to the work that they did and what they're up to now. And today, I'm honored to talk to Jen Fulmer, who has had a very impressive career in the Air Force, retiring as a colonel, a B-1 pilot who flew combat missions, and has been very engaged in veterans issues since returning to her home in Biddeford, Maine. So, Jen, welcome to Maine's Veterans Voices. Great to have a chance to chat.
Thank you, Senator. It's great to be here.
Now, tell me, go back to the beginning, high school in Connecticut. How did you? What was your path to the military from the time you first started thinking about it?
Well, it was kind of a long and winding road, so I'll try to make it sort of short and sweet. But no recruiters were allowed in my high school. I went to Wilton High School in Connecticut. Um, I had no idea that I wanted to be in the military. That was not even on my radar. I went to the University of Connecticut and I started as a journalism major, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do. Um, and I met an individual who was a fellow classmate of mine who was a freshman, but he had been a Marine and he had been in Beirut in 1983 when he got there after the barracks got bombed. His unit went in to help with the cleanup. And people who came back from that operation, a lot of them got free tuition at certain state schools. So the University of Connecticut was giving free tuition. So he was about 5 years older than me, but we were both freshmen. And he was this charismatic guy who could do anything. And all his friends would come from the Marine Corps to visit him. And the camaraderie and the stories that I heard from them I just became fascinated by that. And I was always athletic and adventurous. And the sophomore year of college, I just kind of got this wild hair and went down to the ROTC detachment at the University of Connecticut. And I said, "Hey, I hear you have this, summer officer training. I'd like to go to that." And they said, "Well, you have to take a test. You have to do medical." And so I said, "Okay." So I did that. And then I got a letter at the end of April saying, "Congratulations, you're going to 6 weeks of officer field training at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California beginning in June." And I hadn't told my parents that I had signed up for that
Uh,
yet. I really just wanted to see what military training was like, honestly. I flew out there. I was 19 years old. I went to field training, and it was the greatest experience of my life. I absolutely loved it. Loved every minute of it. Came back just feeling on top of the world, and but I wasn't really ready to sign. It was sort of like I loved it, but then I'm like, oh wait, 4 years. So I ended up not continuing in ROTC. I took a year off to really figure out what I wanted to do. A friend of mine worked at the Connecticut State Capitol and I worked on the Labor and Public Employees Committee for that year. And during that year, a friend of mine gave me a ride in a Cessna,
uh,
and I had decided that I really wanted, like by that time, by sort of the early spring, I decided I really wanted to go to the Air Force. And the senator and the two representatives that I worked for, they gave me letters of recommendation because I had to transfer schools and I had to get back into ROTC with a waiver. Um, and uh, and luckily my parents were very supportive. And everything worked out. And so I redid my sophomore year at University of Northern Colorado, and I was in ROTC for those 3 years. And once I decided that that's what I wanted to do, there was no looking back. I just was laser focused on going in the military, and I was laser focused on flying as well.
now, now, talk about becoming an Air Force pilot as a woman in those days? Were there barriers? Was this something that you had to have you had to overcome in order to get into pilot training?
At the time, there was a separate female pilot board, and so I competed for that. I think it was in the um, beginning of my junior year. And so I got a pilot slot um, during my junior year. Like the end of my junior year is when the results came out. So I got the pilot slot. Um, about a month before I graduated from college, our ROTC instructor came in and said, none of you guys who have pilot slots are going to go to pilot training anymore. It was absolutely devastating because you know how the manpower ebbs and flows. You can never really tell how many are going to retire, how many are going to enlist, and stuff like that. So they had an overage of pilots at the time, which was probably the last time they had an overage of pilots.
Right now, we have a shortage of pilots.
Absolutely, and it's been that way for years. But at the time, they had an overage. So then they changed the decision and said, yes, you will go to pilot training, but you have to go into something else first, and then we will weed you back by date of rank or age, whichever comes first. So I got commissioned. I had to wait 9 months to come on active duty. Then I went into the Air Force. I was a little bit older because I did the long college tour. So I was a personnel officer, which is basically human resources, for 3 years, waiting for pilot training. And you talk about the woman thing. This was actually a blessing in disguise, because if I'd gone to pilot training when I was supposed to go to pilot training, I would have flown tankers or transport aircraft, which there's nothing wrong with that, but that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to fly combat aircraft.
Wasn't there a rule at the time that no women could fly combat missions?
Yes, exactly. So I will never forget the day I was sitting at my desk in personnel in 1993 when the base newspaper came across my desk that said they had changed the policy that women could now fly combat, which was, like I said, it was a blessing. And I got a lot of leadership experience those 3 years before I went to pilot training. So they started me at pilot training when I was 27 and a half. That was the month that I was at the age cutoff. And that's when, I started my flying career, but everything worked out for the best. Like I said, it was a great experience. I got a lot of leadership experience that most people don't get when they go directly to pilot training. And so that really served me well in the future.
Well, you mentioned leadership experience. I believe that the military gives young people more leadership experience at a younger age than pretty much anywhere else. Certainly anywhere else in the private sector. I mean, you can have a young lieutenant who has life or death responsibility.
Absolutely. And I will tell you that being a second lieutenant, I tell everybody this, it was the hardest job I've ever had, because you're coming on active duty. You're a brand new second lieutenant, and I had 18 people working for me. And my two NCOICs, the two people in charge of my two sections, had been in for 20 years. They were master sergeants, E7s. And if you are blessed with a very good one who will sort of take you by the scruff of the neck and behind closed doors explain to you really sort of how you need to lead, then things work out. If you
Well,
don't take advantage of that leadership, you can have some problems.
Esther sort of run the place, right? Generally.
Yeah.
Well, tell me now. Flash forward. You did your pilot training. You ended up in being able to fly combat missions. How did you end up in the B1?
Again, things change all the time, but when I went through pilot training, when you were done with pilot training and we were figuring out the assignment night, which means you get what aircraft you want to fly, we had the 3 pilot training bases all on video teleconference. And so all of the people graduating at Laughlin were in, one room, Reese and I forget the other one. But so they picked a base. Say Laughlin was first. So the person who graduated first in the class would stand up, and the screen had all the different airplanes that were available at that time. So the number one person from Laughlin would stand up and he picked the airplane that he wanted. Then it would go to the next base to their number one, then the next base to their number one, then it came back to us number two. So
Sounds like the NFL draft.
Yeah, exactly. So again, it changes depending on the needs of the Air Force, but at the time I was about right in the middle. And so when I got to choose, there were A-10s, F-16s, and B-1s. And I had an instructor who'd been a B-1 pilot. And I really liked the crew concept. And so I had kind of decided that that's what I wanted if there was one available. So that's what I chose.
Well, and you flew combat missions, something like 90. Where were you? Where were you flying out of, and what were the missions?
The first time was right after 9/11. We were flying out of Diego Garcia. And so I flew the first night of Operation Enduring Freedom. That was my first combat mission. And my last combat mission was when I was the vice wing commander at Al Udeid in 2014. And so I was back there numerous times. The B-1s were flying out of Diego Garcia until 2005, 2006 timeframe. And then we moved up to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. And then the remainder of the time from about 2000, end of 2005, beginning 2006, we were exclusively flying out of Qatar.
Well, describe the B-1 to our listeners. What the size of the plane, the size of the crew, what you carry. Tell us about what it's like to fly a B-1.
So I don't remember the exact measurements uh, 10 years ago, but it's a very large bomber. It carries the largest payload of any bomber in the US inventory, although people think the B-52 does, but in reality the B-1 does. The B-1 is not a nuclear bomber. A lot of people think that too. In the 1990s, it lost the nuclear mission. And so purely conventional. And so when I started flying the B-1, we carried only what I call dumb bombs, bombs that were not guided. So you would drop the weapons and you would do calculations, the jet would do calculations, and they would fall hopefully on the target somewhere near. But um, I really saw a great transition in the aircraft from when I started flying it until when I retired. Until when I retired, basically the glass cockpit modification was being started, and we went from bombs that dumb bombs to GPS aided weapons that were near precision, and then we had a targeting pod that had a laser, so the weapons became very, very, very precise. So the first missions that we were flying in Afghanistan, the first couple of weeks were primarily on fixed targets, so they were primarily on terrorist training camps and some other things like that. After those first 2 weeks, the vast majority of the missions that we flew were close air support. So we were supporting all of our U.S. and coalition partners, all the Army and Marine units on the ground in Afghanistan.
Well, it's ironic that you were flying the B-1 for close air support because you could have chosen the A-10, and that was the primary mission of the A-10.
Yes, but Afghanistan is a very big country. And so A-10s were still doing close air support, but we don't have enough assets to cover all the different operations that were going on in Afghanistan. So every day when you went up to Afghanistan, we went up with a list of missions we were supposed to support. And so sometimes it was just flying overwatch for a convoy. Somebody was maybe taking a convoy from one forward operating base to another forward operating base. And so we were flying air cover in case something happened. Sometimes it was a specific operation that we were there flying air cover. And then other times, and this is where really we came in, it was really a great benefit to have the B-1 in country because we could get anywhere in country very, very fast. And we carried a lot of gas and we could stay on station a long time. So if I was in the southern part of the country and I was supporting a convoy, say, and in the northern part of the country, in Mazar-e Sharif, right up near the border, say there all of a sudden there was a firefight, and our good guys were getting shot at and taking fire, and there was nobody up there at the time to support. We would get called off of what we were doing, and they would say, "How fast can you get up there?" And we'd look and see in Afterburner how fast we could get up there. We'll be there in 20 minutes. And so we were the only platform that could literally touch any place in Afghanistan when needed at any given time.
And you were flying out of Al Udeid at that time, is that correct?
We were. Yes.
And did the Taliban have anything much in the way of surface to air defense? Did you face fire from man pads or stationary any aircraft?
The very first night of enduring, well, first of all, I never felt threatened. It went right after 9/11, that day of 9/11, I was briefing to fly, and obviously we didn't fly. So we went back into our vault and looked up, what does Afghanistan have? Because we figured that's where we were going. And they were assessed to have a few systems that had been non-operational for a long time. So we weren't really that concerned. But they did have some small caliber AAA. And so I had a few different targets that first night. Our first target was down near Kandahar, and then we were going to be going up to Kabul. And I could see what times and people were dropping, and at the same time we were up there. And all of a sudden I saw Kabul light up with a whole bunch of AAA, and I knew the F-18s were up there. And so I called up to the F-18s and I asked them, I'm assuming that was you, right, who just dropped, and then all of a sudden the AAA came up. and I asked them what altitude the AAA was at, and it was all below where we were going to be. So that
Now,
was the only time. That was the only time I saw um, any kind of surface to air threat. Um, we did have one of our aircraft as it was doing a low pass. It's one of the tactics the B-1 would use. Sometimes our weapons were too big. If our friendly forces were in a very close firefight, they didn't want us to drop weapons because it was too dangerous for the friendlies. But one tactic that the B-1 would do is we would drop low and we would go about 1,000 feet above the ground, and we would go over the place where the JTAC told us, that the guy on the ground who was calling us in told us to go, and we would fly and hit our afterburners. They make a very, very loud noise, and then we would pop flares out of the top of the aircraft. And that would generally keep the enemy's head down for long enough for our good guys to either get away or continue, finish what they were doing. And so there was one time when a B-1 came back. This was probably 2013. It actually had a bullet hole in the bottom of the airplane. Nothing was damaged. I mean, they had to fix the hole, but so somebody had actually, just probably been just, shooting up like that.
well, as you know, I serve on the Armed Services Committee, and one of the things we've sort of observed and had hearings on is the fact that for a fairly prolonged period during the War on Terror, we had unrestricted air access. We weren't fighting people that had much in the way of anti-aircraft, and of course now in Ukraine where we're not engaged, but it's all about air superiority and air defense.
Yes.
Did you fly any missions in Iraq, or was it strictly Afghanistan?
I flew 10 missions in Iraq, but not during not during the first part of Iraqi freedom. So when I flew over Iraq, it was 2007. And we were supporting mainly missions, like I told you, like an operation was going on type of thing. So I never dropped weapons in Iraq. And I never actually engaged directly with a unit. We were really doing Overwatch when I was there. Other B-1s did do stuff, but my particular missions, we were doing mainly Overwatch.
You mentioned that the rules changed in the early 90s, and you went through pilot training, then you became a combat pilot. Did the culture change along with it, or was there still a sort of cultural resistance to women in combat?
I'm going to say, and I tell everybody this, the military is a microcosm of the outside world, right? So you're always going to have the people who are the skeptics. You're always going to have, I mean, wherever you go. I never made an issue of it. I never went into my flying squadron. I was the first woman in my flying squadron, first woman aviator. And it was really because it takes time, right? The rule changes, and then it takes time for people to weed into the system. I just worked really hard. I never made a point that I was a woman. It didn't matter to me. I was there to do the mission, to fly beside my brothers and sisters and do what we need to do. And I never got treated any different. Did I run into things occasionally through my career? People who had certain attitudes? Yeah. But I just continued to do what I was doing. And if that particular attitude needed adjustment, then I would do that.
Yeah, well, and your example would help to adjust attitudes, I would think. Now, after the combat missions, you ended up, you retired as a colonel. Talk about the latter stages of your career in the Air Force.
Um, I had really a fascinating career, and I had a lot of great opportunities. I got to travel all over the world. So besides my flying career, I mean, I was in almost every B-1 squadron and got to command the 9th Bomb Squadron and command them in combat in LUD, and that was certainly a highlight. But there were some other jobs I did besides my flying jobs, which were really pretty amazing. I had the opportunity to be an aide to a 4-star general for 18 months when I was a senior captain and major. General Don Cook at the time, he was the Air Education and Training Command commander. And that really opened my eyes. I went kicking and screaming. I did not want to go because I was a squadron weapons officer, and we were in Diego Garcia flying missions, and you can't say no when the 4-star says, I want you to come work for me. So, but
did you do some time? I mean, I want to get your not political opinions, but Were you in the Southcom AOR at some point?
Yeah, that was one of the my best assignments. I was the chief of staff at the Joint Interagency Task Force South, working for Admiral Michelle, Coast Guard Admiral. And so we had all five services represented, all of the federal law enforcement agencies, all the federal intelligence agencies. We had 17 liaison officers from South and Central America and the Caribbean, and a couple from Europe, doing detection and monitoring for illicit trafficking coming up from South America across along the isthmus up to the United States. I learned a tremendous amount at that job, and it was really fascinating to see the apparatus um, behind the operation.
But the at that time the mission was interdiction, not kinetic.
So the mission was detection and monitoring. So the Title 10 mission, detection and monitoring. And so any kind of interdiction that occurred was Coast Guard Title 14, law
Right,
enforcement.
right.
And so what's that?
I was going to say it was a Coast Guard would do the interdictions and the enforcement, and
Yes.
your role was identifying the targets and the what was going on in the region.
And it was support. For instance, the Navy would have a Navy ship, and they would have a Coast Guard detachment on board, or a Navy Coast, or excuse me, a Coast Guard cutter was there. Maybe they had a helicopter, which is called a Hitron helicopter, which has a sniper on board. That sniper was not for people. That sniper was for engines. So the go fast boats that had like four of these way powerful engines. Uh, once once they were identified, the Coast Guard, if there was a Hitron available, would fly out there. They would shoot the motors to stop the boat, so that now the Coast Guard rib carrying a Coast Guard detachment would go and arrest the folks if that was appropriate and apprehend the stuff. So it was purely, it was not a kinetic mission. It was a detection and monitoring mission, working hand in hand with the Title 14 Coast Guard, who did the interdiction.
Now, how'd you happen to end up settling in Maine?
It was a God thing. I was home. I was in Al Udeid for a year as a vice wing commander from 2013 to 14, and I came home in January for my 2 weeks of R&R. My husband flew for NetJets, so he was living in Massachusetts at the time, and we got 2 nights in a bed and breakfast up in Portland while I was home. And I was not planning to retire. We were not looking for a house. And we drove up along the Maine coast, and we saw this for sale sign, and we all of a sudden went up and looked at the pictures and asked if we could see it 2 days later on our drive back. And halfway through the night, when Eddie and I were talking, I said, I guess it's time to retire. We felt called to be here, and I had a very different conversation with my boss when I got back to Qatar than when I left.
I'm sure.
So then
Well,
I had to do one more year in DC, and then I came up here.
I have a friend who said you should never look at real estate unless you're prepared to buy, and it sounds like that's exactly what happened with you.
We weren't prepared to buy.
Well, it's wonderful. We're delighted that you landed in Maine, literally, and talk about post after retirement, because I know you got involved in Boots to Roots, which I've met with. It's a wonderful organization. Describe that and why you got engaged with what they do.
Well, I've done nothing since I retired that I thought I was going to do when I retired from the Air Force. I came to Maine. I wanted to be engaged in the community. I wanted to give back to my community. And in order to do that, I needed to understand my community. And so I took the fall after I retired to get to know Biddeford and to volunteer in a bunch of places. And then I started my official job search in January 2016, which was challenging. I thought I had a good resume, but later on, after I learned more about it, I realized I did not. My friend Dave Hickey called me, who you know. He called. He was one of my
I
first instructors. What's
think
that?
Dave's plane out in South Dakota once. He showed me. He allowed me to climb up in the cockpit and prowl around.
Yeah. Well, he was one of the best tactical instructors I've ever had, and we were good friends. And he had retired a couple years before I did, and he had a terrible transition experience. Here's a guy who was a colonel. He had an advanced degree. He had commanded at 2 levels, and he gets to Maine, and he's from Maine, and he literally almost ended up living in his car. And so he called me one day in January when I was starting my job search, and he told me about his concept for Boots to Roots. And I was listening to him, and I was like, yeah, this is really needed here, because I was starting to feel sort of the challenge. And he said, how would you like to be on our board? I said, absolutely, I'll be on your board. When is your next board meeting? And he said, yeah, I guess we ought to have one of those. Um, and so he and his friend John Manganello, who was our board president, they worked at Bath Iron Works at the time. They came up with the concept of Boots to Roots, and they were doing it sort of by word of mouth, and sort of already starting, but they both worked full time, and there was no way they were going to be able to get this thing moving in the direction it needed to go. And I really felt strongly that it was very needed. And so I asked my husband, I had a retired check. He had a good job. And I said, what do you think about me working for free for a few years? I said, I think this is really something we need to do. And he said, yeah, absolutely. So, um, so I took it, and the reason we needed to do it was because we really needed to be able to help active duty military who were planning to come to Maine get networked in. There's a great National Guard network here, but as you know, we don't have any active duty bases. And so the same connections that folks have, like in Virginia or somewhere else, don't exist here. And you have to kind of create them. And so Boots to Roots was built to do that, but also prepare people up to a year before they come to Maine. And the goal was always so that they get hired within 2 months of coming to Maine, and that they stay in their first post-military job for at least a year. And we've been almost 10 years now, and those numbers have been in the 90% for both of those goals. And my goal was to build it until it didn't need me anymore. And so we were able to hire our first paid employee in 2019 with the intent that he would become the executive director in the next January. And they've been running great ever since and doing amazing things.
Well, you're preaching to the choir. One of my very first hearings when I got here 12 years ago with the Armed Services Committee, we got to talking about the transition. And I remember saying at the hearing to some military Pentagon witness, you guys should spend as much time, money, and effort on the transition out as you do on recruiting. And that's been one of my missions. And I have to tell you, just this week, the National Defense Authorization Act passed a few days ago, and in it is a provision that I've been pushing for 5 or 6 years. It got pulled out and didn't make it, and it finally made it. That basically allows the military to share the contact information of the returning veteran with the state veterans office when they're coming back. My concept has always been, somebody meets you at the airport and says, welcome to Maine, here are the options, here are all the programs. And I got to tell you, I'm pretty excited, because this is something, down here you work on things for years and years, and then suddenly it happens. And this is one that happened just this week. So talk to me about the transition. I mean, I think it doesn't get enough attention. The other thing we've been able to get changed is to allow, or actually this is a bill that's still pending, that will allow veterans to allow active duty members of the military to enroll in VA healthcare before they leave. So it's a seamless handoff to the VA. So those are the kinds of things, and Boots to Roots, of course, it fits right into that.
Yeah, that's great, Senator. The first thing, we've been wanting that for a long time. And I appreciate you doing that, because I know we talked about that a couple of years ago, or a few years ago. It was a few years ago now. But that's absolutely needed. And I tell you, Boots to Roots is the only organization that's working with folks before they come back. And that's exactly what is needed, is who's coming back. We can connect with them ahead of time, get them pulled in here, connected with whoever they need to be connected with, do their resume, do their interview coaching. And oh, by the way, now Boots to Roots is connected with tons and tons of businesses all around the state of Maine. Many of them who are supporting, who are contributing donors to Boots to Roots, because they know the value.
Yeah, and they want. I mean, veterans make great employees. They want them. So the fact that you've set up this kind of switchboard that allows people to have those kind of contacts, and as you say, coaching and just informing people who have just left, who are transitioning of all the array of programs that are available for assistance. I think that's absolutely critical. And your batting average sounds like it's pretty damn high.
Yeah, they're doing a great job. And like I said, I pretty much was executive director till January of 2020, and then I was the board chair for 2 more years. And then they've been running great. I think they got like their thousandth application this year.
Wow.
Total, like for the first 10 years. So they're doing a great job. But we really appreciate your support, Senator. And those steps that you have taken will make a huge difference, a huge
Well,
positive difference.
I don't usually pat myself on the back in these things, but talking about this and I'm as you can tell, I'm pretty excited that this just happened this week after we've been
Great.
working on it for years. It's been a long time to get it across the line, and it just happened. So, well,
Music to my ears.
well, what else have I missed, Jen? We want to share about either your career in the Air Force or post Air Force. What are the messages that we want to leave for folks who are going to be looking at these interviews years from now?
Well, for me personally, I loved my Air Force career. I loved everything about it. But service is really the thing that is ingrained in my heart. And there's so much people say thank you for your service, and I deeply, deeply appreciate that. But service comes in so many different forms, and service is so needed in our communities. And so after I was done with Boots to Roots, um, actually I had an Air Force colonel Afghan Air Force colonel who was a friend of mine. It was an air war college with me. And when Kabul fell apart in 2021, he had been a colonel, retired. He had been on like a commentator after he retired on Tolo News, which is a major news station over there, very pro-democracy, pro-women, anti-Taliban. He was a huge target when all that happened. So it's a long story, but we ended up finding a couple of friends of mine who were veterans who knew him, and we found the right contacts, and were able to get him and his 10 family members out of Afghanistan 16 hours before that bomb went off at the Abbey Gate. And so I spent the next 2 years sort of after Boots Truce. It was right when I was transitioning out of the board to really full time helping this family of 10 or 11 resettle here in Biddeford. And I learned a tremendous amount. Tarlin Ahmedoff, the state refugee coordinator at the time, helped me a lot with information. But so was able to do that and learn a lot about the aspects of those parts of the community. And now lately in the last 2 years, I have mainly been volunteering at a couple organizations in town and with my church, and really working with the homeless and addicted community, which is another big problem.
Well,
And
I, I mean, your life is an example of service, and it bothers me these days sometimes that we got people that don't respect public service, that think that, if you work for a low salary and are serving other people, you're sort of a loser and you're not. But just the opposite. I mean, our teachers, our first responders, the military service, of course, is so important. And you mentioned the Afghan family. I mean, it's tragic what happened in Washington with this Afghan fellow that shot the two National Guardsmen. But
right,
there was a stoppage of all people from Afghanistan, and we were going to send them back. I checked the numbers. We have 190,000 Afghans in this country who came, most of whom helped us, and
right,
put their lives on the line for us. And if they had to go back, they would be targets of the Taliban. And so to punish 189,999 for the actions of one
right.
is just not right.
No, it's not. We used to call that in the military, one person goes in their shorts and we all wear diapers. It's easier to just make this blanket rule than it is to address and do the right thing to correct this, one particular person. But I agree with you. I pray that things change. And there's a lot of really good people in this family. He is a brother to me and my husband, and they have their asylum approved. They had just put in their green card applications in the spring, so I'm hoping that when things loosen up, they'll go through. Um,
Well, I certainly hope so too, and that's something else we can work together on. Well, Jen,
Absolutely.
thank you. It's a cliche to say thank you for your service, but I mean it, and I mean your service not only in the Air Force, but subsequently. And I'm just delighted that you had that found that or saw that for sale sign in Biddeford, and that you're with us. It's been a blessing for Maine to have you here. Thanks so much for joining me this morning, and we'll look forward to seeing you around. I'm sure that there will be times when our paths will cross, and I hope you'll, and I know that you'll continue your service to your community and to Maine. Thanks again for everything.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to you also for your service. It takes a pretty strong person to be able to do what you do and for so long, and especially in the landscape that we that you serve under today. So thank you for doing that for the greater good. We deeply appreciate it.
Thank you, Jen. We'll see you later.